This tutorial builds on elements demonstrated previously in the movies, how to enter a vendor invoice and how to enter a credit memo. Welcome to Sapphire One. Today I'm demonstrating how to enter a vendor journal. A vendor journal is generally used to adjust vendor balances, such as reversing entries after they've been posted, reallocating funds in the general ledger, and balancing out minor sums. If I need to amend a transaction that has not yet been posted, I can simply modify the original data entry. To do this, I go to the Payables drop-down menu and select Transaction Inquiry. Sapphire One then presents me with a list of all my current transactions. From this list, I select the transaction that requires adjustment and then choose either the Modify button here on the toolbar or use the keyboard shortcut Command M on a Mac or Control M on a PC to open and make changes to my transaction. However, after a transaction has been posted, its status will be displayed as yes in the Transaction Inquiry screen. This means that it is no longer editable, and even if I open the transaction using the Modify method, I will not be able to make any changes. So to make an amendment to a posted transaction, I need to create a vendor journal and then allocate the original transaction to it. The vendor journal is the fourth data entry item located on the Payables menu in the Accounts mode of Sapphire One, and when I select it, a new data entry screen appears on my desktop. As with the majority of data entry screens in the Accounts mode of Sapphire One, this window has been divided into four main areas. On the left we have the Transaction and Destination areas, and to the right there's the Management Review and Standing Transaction areas. Let's say I'm creating this vendor journal because I was over-credited an amount on a vendor's invoice when I was issued a refund, and I have since posted both the invoice and the credit memo. First I need to link this journal to the vendor, and I do this by entering their ID into the vendor ID field. Remember, if the field is blue, it's searchable, so I can enter just the @ symbol to bring up the entire list of all my vendors, or I can enter a part of the vendor's ID followed by the @ symbol to bring up a reduced list, and from here I simply select the one I need. I now have the option of manually entering all the details for this journal, but to save some time, I'll use the copy transaction method that I demonstrated in how to enter a credit memo and let Sapphire One automatically insert the details for me. To do this, I select the Transaction tab in the Management Review area. When a transaction is linked to a particular client or vendor by their ID, the Transaction tab displays their last 100 or so account transactions. First, I locate the original vendor credit memo in the Transaction tab, and for this demonstration, I'll choose the credit with the external reference number of 2-000. With the transaction highlighted, I either right-click with my mouse on a PC or Control-click on a Mac, and Sapphire One now provides me with two additional methods of entering the data. Because I want to replicate both the line items into the destination area and the transaction details of the original credit memo into the transaction area, I will select the Copy Transaction rather than the Copy Lines method. When I do this, Sapphire One copies all of the destination and transaction details into my journal. Next, I need to adjust the amount of the line item in the destination area to reflect the amount of the overpayment. Let's say the credit memo I issued for my refund was over by $40. I then enter the new balance into the total field in the transaction area to balance my transaction. I will also add a note in the memo field for future reference, and I'll use the clock button to timestamp and date my entry. My out of balance amount is 0, so my green tick is active, and when I select it, Sapphire One accepts and closes the data entry screen. That completes the data entry component of our journal. The next step is to offset the original credit against the vendor journal I just created. To do this, go to the Payables drop-down menu and select Allocation Inquiry. By default, Sapphire One only displays transactions that are waiting to be allocated, and as the original credit memo I entered for the refund has already been allocated to the vendor's invoice, it won't be displayed in this list. To include my previously allocated transactions, I need to open the Sapphire One Find screen. To do this, I can either select the Find button here on the toolbar or use the keyboard shortcut Command F on a Mac or Control F on a PC. From the Find Vendor Allocations drop-down menu change the current selection from Standard to All Records, and then choose the Find button. Now the Allocation Inquiry screen displays all of my current allocation records, including those that are already allocated. Next, we locate the original credit memo, which has the reference number of 2-000. If I double-click on the credit memo line, Sapphire One simply opens and displays the transaction details, but I can't modify the allocation of this credit from within this screen. To locate the actual allocation details for my credit memo, I need to access some additional functionality within Sapphire One. Whenever we are in any of the inquiry screens within Sapphire One, we have access to a list of additional tools. For instance, when I open the Transaction Inquiry screen, I can go to the Tools button here on my toolbar and select the drop-down arrow to access a menu of additional functions. The Tools menu is divided into 3 sections. The top 2 sections display tools that are unique to the particular inquiry screen you are in, and the first tool on the list can be activated by clicking directly on the Tools button rather than using the arrow to display the entire menu. The third section of this menu displays tools that are standard across all inquiry screens. If you want to restrict a user's access to a particular tool, you can, and the deactivated tool will appear as grayed out on the Tools menu. Now I'll close out the Transaction Inquiry screen and reopen the Allocations Inquiry screen. When I select the Tools drop-down menu this time, you can see that I lose the functions that don't apply and gain others that are relevant to allocation inquiries. The first tool in this menu is Allocation. This means that the Allocation tool will be activated if I click directly on the Tools button itself. So to retrieve the allocation details for my credit memo, first I need to use the Find screen to change the current selection from Standard to All Records, as we did previously. I then locate my original credit memo, but this time, instead of double-clicking with my mouse, I will click on my credit memo line just once to highlight it. Now I need to activate the Allocation tool. This is the first tool on the list, so I can either select it from the Tools drop-down menu or simply click on the Tools button itself, and Sapphire One now presents me with the allocation details for my credit memo. If I look at the position area of my allocation screen, I can see that the credit memo has been allocated in its entirety, as there is no remainder left to apply. I can see in the allocation lines area that the full amount has been applied to the original vendor invoice. The first step is to unallocate my credit memo, and to do this I simply click once on the vendor invoice line. My remainder to be allocated is now the total amount of the credit memo. Next, I need to allocate part of the credit memo to my vendor journal to offset the overpayment. To do this, I click once on my new vendor journal in the allocation lines area, which leaves me with a remainder for the correct amount of the refund. I now allocate this back to the original invoice by clicking again on the invoice allocation line. My total allocated is displaying the full amount of my credit memo, so I'll select the green tick and Sapphire One accepts and closes the allocation screen. Now when I go to the Transaction Inquiry screen and open the original invoice, the Allocations tab in the Management Review area shows that the correct amount for the refund is being applied. That completes the vendor journal data entry and allocation. There is, however, another method of achieving the same result. If you need to create a journal that duplicates a previously posted transaction, such as when reversing an entry in its entirety, Sapphire One has provided us with a very handy tool. To demonstrate this, I need to open my Transaction Inquiry screen, so I'll go to the Payables menu and select Transaction Inquiry. To make this easier to see, I'll reduce my Transaction Inquiry list so as it only displays the 2 transactions that we will be looking at. To do this, I select the first transaction and then, whilst holding down the Shift key, I select the second transaction with my mouse. Next, go to the Options drop-down menu and select the Show Subset option. As with all the menu items in Sapphire One, there is a shortcut, and for this option, it's Command-G on a Mac or Control-G on a PC. When I select it, Sapphire One reduces my transaction list to display only those items I highlighted. If I want to view all my transactions, I go to the Options menu again, but this time I'll select Show All, or use the shortcut Command-H on a Mac or Control-H on a PC. I'll quickly reduce my list again by selecting the items and using the shortcut Command or Control-G. Now here is my invoice and here is my credit. You can see both transactions have been posted because the status is yes. And when I use the Modify button to open one, I can't change anything. When I look at the Allocations tab of my invoice, I can see that 100% of the credit has been applied to it. I want to reverse the credit, but rather than creating a vendor journal and then reallocating the credit to it, as I did previously, this time I will let Sapphire One do the work for me. I'll close this window and select the vendor credit line in the transaction inquiry screen. Next, I select Tools, and Sapphire One presents me with a list of functions that are applicable to transaction inquiries. I'll scroll down to Reverse Transaction, which is the fourth function from the bottom of the list. And when I select it, Sapphire One displays a message asking me to confirm that I want to proceed. I do, so I'll choose Yes. Sapphire One then requests the transaction date for the reversal. I'm happy with today's date, so I'll leave it as it is and select OK. I now have 3 transactions: the original invoice, the credit, and the journal. When I open the journal that was created by Sapphire One and select the Allocations tab, I can see that the credit has been applied in full. And now when I open the original invoice and select the Allocations tab, I can see that the credit has been removed. The Reverse Transaction tool simplifies the process greatly, but remember, this tool can only be used when you are reversing a transaction in its entirety. So that's it for our movie, how to enter and allocate a vendor journal. I hope this was helpful and thank you for watching.